Welcome to the Fog Hut, where the rain whispers and stories come alive. Before you settle in to relax, share with us where you're listening from in the comments. Your support keeps these tales alive. First story. The discovery was entirely accidental. I had been moving boxes into the basement of my new home, a modest but charming house I had purchased at the edge of town. The basement smelled faintly of damp wood and forgotten things, its corners cloaked in shadows that no amount of light seemed able to dispel. I was stacking a box of old books when I noticed the crate tucked beneath a wooden shelf. It was small and unremarkable, its edges scuffed from years of neglect. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it free, coughing as a plume of dust rose into the air. Inside was a camera, its brass fittings tarnished and its leather casing cracked with age. It was heavier than I expected, its build sturdy and deliberate. The lens gleamed faintly in the dim light, almost as if it were alive. I turned it over, examining the intricate details of its design. For something so old, it seemed remarkably intact. Setting it aside, I continued unpacking, my mind only half focused on the task. The camera lingered at the edge of my thoughts, pulling at my curiosity. By the time I finished for the day, it was sitting on the desk in my study, an unspoken invitation to explore its secrets. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself drawn back to the camera. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than it should. I turned on a lamp, its light casting soft shadows across the room, and began cleaning the camera. The cloth brushed away years of grime, revealing the intricate craftsmanship beneath. Despite its age, the mechanism seemed intact, the dials turning smoothly under my fingers. I wondered who it had belonged to, what stories it had captured. Had it been a tool for documenting life's joys or sorrows? Or had it been abandoned, forgotten, because of something else entirely? Unable to resist, I decided to test it. Grabbing an old roll of film I'd found in another box, I loaded it into the camera. The process was surprisingly simple, as if the camera had been waiting for this moment. I stepped outside, the evening air cool against my skin. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. I aimed the camera at the horizon, the trees silhouetted against the vibrant sky. The shutter clicked with a satisfying snap, the sound cutting through the stillness like a whisper. I took a few more shots, each one feeling like a small act of discovery, before returning inside. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, the camera sitting on the desk once more. I planned to develop the film the next day, eager to see if the camera still worked. As I lay in bed that night, the image of the camera lingered in my mind, its lens gleaming faintly in the darkness. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was restless. My dreams were fragmented, flashes of light, the sound of the shutter clicking, and a shadow that moved at the edge of my vision. I woke several times, the silence of the house pressing against me like a weight. The next morning, I set up my small darkroom, a holdover from my brief dabbling in photography during college. The process of developing the film was comforting in its familiarity, the motion steadying my frayed nerves. One by one, the images began to appear, the shapes and lines sharpening into focus. The first few shots were unremarkable, trees, the skyline, the faint outline of the neighborhood. But then I reached the last photo, the one of the horizon. My breath caught as I held it up to the light. There was a shadow. It was faint, barely noticeable against the vibrant colors of the sky, but it was there. A shape that didn't belong, standing at the edge of the frame. It wasn't the silhouette of a tree or a trick of the light. It was a figure, human in form, but indistinct, its edges blurred as if it were dissolving into the air. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. No one had been there when I took the picture, I was sure of it. I had been alone, the street silent, the houses empty. And yet, there it was. Setting the photo aside, I examined the others, searching for any similar anomalies. But they were clean, each one perfectly normal. It was only that one shot, that one moment, where the shadow had appeared. I told myself it was nothing, a flaw in the film, perhaps, or a trick of the aging camera. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The shadow was too deliberate, too precise. It felt intentional, as if it were meant to be seen. As the day wore on, the unease settled deeper into my bones. The shadow lingered at the edge of my thoughts, a question without an answer. That night, I found myself staring at the camera once more, its lens gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was waiting, and so was I. The shadow in the photograph wouldn't leave my thoughts. I spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a defect in the film or a flaw in the lens. But the more I stared at it, the harder it became to believe those explanations. There was an intention to its shape, a purpose in its placement that defied logic. That evening, I found myself drawn back to the camera. It sat on the desk where I had left it, its lens gleaming faintly in the lamplight. The shadows in the room seemed to shift as I approached, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I picked up the camera, its weight grounding me, and turned it over in my hands. "Let's see if you're hiding anything else," I muttered, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. I loaded another roll of film, my fingers steady despite the unease that coiled in my chest. This time, I decided to take photos around the house. If there was something wrong with the camera, it should show up again. And if there wasn't, the thought trailed off as I raised the camera to my eye. The viewfinder framed the living room, its furniture casting long shadows in the dim light. I took a shot, the click of the shutter loud in the stillness. Moving through the house, I photographed the kitchen, the hallway, the staircase, places familiar and ordinary, their shapes comforting in their normalcy. The last photo I took was of the basement door. It stood slightly ajar, its dark interior barely visible in the faint light from the hallway. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't hesitate. The shutter clicked, the sound echoing faintly, and then it was done. The next morning, I returned to the darkroom, the unease from the previous day still clinging to me. Developing the film was a slow, methodical process, one I usually found calming. But today, the anticipation was unbearable. My hands shook slightly as I pulled the first photo from the solution and held it up to the light. The living room was empty, its shadows still and undisturbed. The kitchen was the same, its countertops bare, its corners quiet. The hallway and staircase revealed nothing unusual. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, to believe that the first shadow had been a fluke. And then I reached the last photo. It was the basement door. But unlike when I had taken the shot, the door wasn't slightly ajar. In the photograph, it was wide open. And standing just inside the doorway was the shadow. This time, it was sharper, its edges more defined. It was taller than I had imagined, its form unmistakably human. But its features were missing, its face a blank void that seemed to swallow the light around it. It stood there, silent and unmoving, as if waiting for something. I dropped the photo, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. Had the door opened on its own? Had the shadow been there when I took the picture, hidden by the darkness? Or was it something else entirely, something I couldn't explain? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I avoided the basement, the camera, the photographs. But the shadow lingered at the edge of my thoughts, a presence I couldn't ignore. By the time night fell, the unease had grown into a gnawing fear. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the house silent around me. Sleep wouldn't come, my thoughts too loud, too restless. The image of the shadow standing in the doorway played over and over in my mind, its blank face a void that seemed to pull me in. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came. I was standing in the hallway, the basement door wide open before me. The air was cold, the kind of chill that settled deep in your bones. The shadow stood just inside, its form towering and still. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadow raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate. It pointed at me, its void-like face tilting slightly, as if it were studying me. And then, without a sound, it stepped forward. I woke with a start, my chest heaving, the blankets tangled around me. The room was dark, the silence heavy. My eyes darted to the doorway, half expecting to see the shadow standing there. But it was empty, the house still and quiet. The camera sat on the desk, its lens gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was waiting, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, I avoided the basement altogether. The image of the shadow standing in the doorway was burned into my mind, its blank face haunting me at every turn. I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the unease followed me, clinging to me like a second skin. The camera sat on the desk in my study, its lens gleaming faintly in the morning light. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, not after what I had seen. But as the hours passed, a nagging thought began to take hold. The shadow hadn't been there when I took the photo, or at least, I hadn't seen it. Was it possible the camera was revealing something I couldn't see with my own eyes? By the afternoon, curiosity won out over fear. I retrieved the camera, my hands trembling slightly as I turned it over in my hands. There was something almost sentient about it, as if it were aware of the attention I was giving it. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. This time, I decided to focus on the areas of the house where the shadows seemed to linger the most. The staircase, the living room cornered by the old grandfather clock, and, reluctantly, the basement door. Each shot felt like a challenge, a test of whether I could face whatever might appear in the photographs. I developed the film in silence, the faint hum of the equipment the only sound in the room. The first few photos revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the staircase and the empty corners of the house. But as I reached the final photo, my breath caught in my throat. It was the basement door again. This time, it was closed, but something was different. In the shadowed reflection of the door's surface, I could see the faint outline of a face. It was blurred, indistinct, but unmistakably human. The empty void where the eyes should have been stared back at me, and for a moment, I felt as if it could see me. I dropped the photo, stumbling back from the table. My heart pounded in my chest, my thoughts racing. The shadow was becoming more defined, more present. And it wasn't just appearing in the photographs anymore, it was starting to interact with the house. That night, I barricaded the basement door. It felt like a futile gesture, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving it open. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if it were listening. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the images over and over. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, the dreams were worse. I was standing in the living room, the camera in my hands. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the lens. The shadows were deeper now, moving at the edges of my vision, shifting like smoke. The air was thick, heavy, making it hard to breathe. The shadow appeared at the top of the staircase, its form sharper than before. It moved slowly, deliberately, descending one step at a time. Its face was still a void, but there was something almost purposeful in the way it tilted its head, as if it were studying me. "You see me?" a voice whispered, low and rasping. It wasn't coming from the shadow, but from everywhere, the words threading through the air like smoke. I tried to move, to run, but my body was frozen. The shadow reached the bottom of the stairs, its presence overwhelming. It extended a hand, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, and pointed at the camera in my hands. "You brought me here." I woke with a start, my chest heaving, the sheets damp with sweat. The house was silent again, but the dream lingered, its weight pressing against my thoughts. I turned to look at the camera, half expecting it to have moved on its own. But it was still there, sitting on the desk, its lens gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was waiting, and I didn't know if I had the strength to face what it wanted me to see. The morning came slowly, the light of the sun weak and pale through the heavy curtains. I hadn't slept much, my dreams fragmented and haunted by the shadow's voice. Its words echoed in my mind, "You brought me here." An accusation I couldn't shake. I spent most of the morning pacing the house, avoiding the basement and the camera altogether. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the house was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows seemed louder, more deliberate. It was as though the house was alive, watching, waiting for me to make a move. By noon, I couldn't take the tension anymore. The camera sat on the desk in my study, its lens catching the faint light streaming through the window, I sat down in front of it, staring at the object that had turned my life upside down. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the weight of the camera grounding me in the moment. "Let's finish this," I murmured, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to, the camera or myself. I loaded another roll of film, the motions mechanical, my mind buzzing with questions I didn't want to ask. This time, I decided to focus entirely on the basement. If the shadow was connected to that part of the house, maybe I could find some answers, or at least some way to stop it. The door to the basement creaked as I opened it, the sound sharp in the stillness of the house. The air inside was cold, the faint scent of damp earth filling my lungs. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step echoing in the enclosed space. The basement was unchanged, its corners dark and filled with forgotten objects. I raised the camera to my eye, framing the room through the viewfinder. The shadows shifted slightly as I moved, their shapes fluid and unnatural. I took a shot, the click of the shutter reverberating through the silence. I turned toward the far corner, where an old cabinet stood half open. The space around it seemed darker, the shadows pulling at its base like liquid. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat, before raising the camera again. The shutter clicked, the sound sharp and final. The last photo I took was of the stairs, the view angled upward toward the doorway. The light from the hallway spilled into the frame, casting long shadows down the steps. The camera felt heavier in my hands as I took the shot, the weight of its presence pressing against me. Back in the darkroom, the process of developing the photos felt slower than usual. My hands moved on autopilot, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. The first photo emerged, a wide shot of the basement, empty save for the usual clutter. But something was off. In the far corner, just at the edge of the frame, the shadow was there. It was faint, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakable. The second photo was worse. The cabinet in the corner was open now, though I hadn't touched it. Inside, the darkness seemed deeper, more alive. And there, peering out from the shadows, was the faint outline of a face. It was clearer than before, its edges sharper, its void-like eyes staring directly at the camera. I nearly dropped the photo, my chest tightening as a wave of nausea washed over me. The third photo was no better. The shot of the stairs showed the shadow halfway up, its form more defined than ever. Its elongated limbs clung to the edges of the steps, its blank face tilted upward as if it were looking directly at me. The air in the room felt colder, the weight of the photos pressing against my mind. I backed away from the table, the photos slipping from my hands to scatter across the floor. The shadows in the room seemed darker now, their edges sharper, their movements almost deliberate. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The photos were still on the floor of the darkroom, but I couldn't bear to touch them again. The camera sat on the desk, its lens gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I could feel its presence even from across the house, a constant reminder of the shadow and its growing power. The dreams came again, though I wasn't sure if I was truly asleep. I was standing in the basement, the shadow towering over me, its form more solid, more real. Its void-like eyes stared into mine, its voice a low rasp that seemed to echo in my chest. "You can't stop it," it said. "You brought it here. Now, it will stay." I woke with a start, the weight of its words pressing against me. The house was silent, but the silence felt wrong, too heavy. The camera waited, its presence undeniable, its purpose still unknown. And I knew, deep down, that the shadow wasn't just in the photographs anymore. It was here, in the house, and it wasn't going to leave. The days that followed felt like an endless blur. The weight of the shadow's presence pressed on every moment, turning the house from a refuge into a prison. I avoided the basement entirely, refusing to even glance at the door. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling of being watched persisted. The camera remained on the desk, untouched since the last set of photos. Its lens seemed darker now, as though it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. I couldn't bring myself to use it again, but neither could I get rid of it. The idea of destroying it felt wrong, as if doing so would provoke something I wasn't prepared to face. One night, as I sat in the living room with a single lamp casting weak light across the space, I heard it, a soft creak coming from the staircase. My breath caught, and I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was descending the stairs. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, clutching it tightly as I stood. The shadows seemed to ripple, shifting in ways they shouldn't have. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved toward the hallway, each step slow and deliberate. The house was silent now, the air thick and heavy. When I reached the base of the stairs, I stopped. The shadows at the top of the staircase were darker than the rest, an inky void that seemed to breathe. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a faint outline shifting within the darkness. And then it was gone, swallowed by the silence. I didn't sleep that night. The camera sat on the desk in my study, its presence a constant weight. The photos from the basement were still scattered across the floor of the darkroom, but I couldn't bear to look at them again. The shadow wasn't just in the photographs anymore, it was in the house. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep running from it. The shadow was growing stronger, more real. Ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. I needed answers, and the only way to find them was through the camera. Reluctantly, I loaded another roll of film. My hands trembled as I turned the dials, the familiar motions now tainted with dread. This time, I would document the entire house, every corner and crevice. If the shadow was here, I needed to know where and how far it had spread. I started in the living room, the camera's shutter clicking loudly in the oppressive silence. The dining room, the hallway, the staircase, each space felt colder, more lifeless, as I moved through the house. The last photo I took was of the basement door. It was closed, but the air around it felt heavier, charged with an unseen energy. Developing the photos was agonizing. Every second felt like an eternity as the images slowly emerged, the shapes and lines sharpening into focus. The first few photos revealed nothing unusual, empty rooms, lifeless furniture. But as I reached the shot of the staircase, my stomach twisted. The shadow was there. It stood at the base of the stairs, its form sharper than ever, its void-like face staring directly at the camera. Its hands were outstretched, long and unnaturally thin, as if reaching for something or someone. The next photo, of the basement door, was worse. The door was open now, the darkness inside swallowing the frame. And within that darkness, a pair of eyes glowed faintly, their edges blurred but unmistakably watching. I backed away from the table, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The room felt colder, the shadows pressing closer. The camera sat on the desk, its lens glinting faintly in the dim light, as if mocking me. That night, the dreams returned. I was standing in the basement, the shadow towering over me, its presence suffocating. Its voice was louder now, clearer, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "You cannot stop it," it said. "It is part of you now." I woke in a cold sweat, the echoes of its voice ringing in my ears. The house was silent, but the silence was no longer comforting. It was a void, an absence of sound that felt alive in its own right. The shadow was no longer confined to the photographs. It was here, in the house, in the walls, in the air I breathed. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't going to leave. The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear and unease. The shadow was no longer confined to the photographs. It was in the house, moving just out of sight, lingering at the edges of my vision. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow sent a chill down my spine. The house had become a living entity, its silence oppressive, its presence suffocating. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and stepped out the front door. But the moment I crossed the threshold, a wave of nausea hit me, strong and sudden, forcing me to my knees. The air outside felt wrong, thick and heavy, as if the house itself was refusing to let me go. I stumbled back inside, my chest heaving, the weight of the decision pressing against me. The camera sat on the desk, its lens glinting faintly in the dim light. It seemed to pulse with energy, as though it were alive. I avoided it as best I could, but its presence was impossible to ignore. It was waiting for me, calling to me, demanding my attention. That night, the dreams were worse. I was standing in the basement, the shadow towering over me, its form sharper and more defined. Its void-like face stared into mine, its voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my chest. "You cannot escape," it said. "The cycle is complete. The house, the camera, the shadow, they are one. And so are you." The dream shifted. I was holding the camera, its weight heavier than ever. The lens glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that illuminated the room. The shadow moved closer, its hand outstretched, pointing at the camera. "Look," it said. "See what you have brought." I woke with a start, the echoes of the shadow's voice ringing in my ears. The room was dark, the air heavy, the silence deafening. I turned to the desk, half expecting to see the shadow standing there, but it was empty. The camera, however, seemed closer, its lens gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, I gave in. The house wasn't going to let me leave, and the shadow wasn't going to stop. If I wanted answers, I had to face the camera one last time. I loaded a fresh roll of film, my hands trembling as I turned the dials. This time, I would photograph everything, the house, the basement, the shadows. Whatever the camera wanted me to see, I would face it. The first photo was of the living room, its furniture cast in sharp relief against the pale light. The second was the hallway, its shadows darker than usual. The third was the staircase, the light from the window barely illuminating the steps. The last photo was of the basement door, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. As I developed the photos, my breath caught in my throat. The first few were unremarkable, the rooms empty and still. But as I reached the final photo, my hands shook. The basement door was open. Inside, the shadow stood, its form fully realized. It was no longer just an outline or a blur, it was a figure, tall and imposing, its face a void of nothingness. Its hands were outstretched, reaching toward the camera, as if trying to pull me in. The whispers started then, soft at first, like a distant hum. They grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with their chaotic chorus. I stumbled back, the photo slipping from my hands, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The camera sat on the desk, its lens glowing faintly now, pulsing in time with the whispers. The air in the room felt colder, the shadows pressing closer, their edges sharp and deliberate. That night, the shadow appeared in my dream again. It stood over me, its presence suffocating, its voice a low rasp. "You are the keeper," it said. "The cycle cannot be broken. The house, the camera, the shadow, they are bound. And so are you." I woke with a start, the weight of its words pressing against me. The house was silent, but the silence was no longer comforting. It was alive, breathing, waiting. The shadow was no longer just in the photographs or the basement. It was everywhere, a constant presence that I could no longer escape. The whispers were no longer confined to my dreams. They lingered in the air, threading through the silence of the house like an invisible current. No matter where I went, I could feel them pressing against my thoughts, an unrelenting presence that refused to let go. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The house had consumed every part of me, leaving no room for anything else. The camera sat on the desk, its lens glowing faintly in the dim light. I avoided it as best I could, but its pull was undeniable. It wanted something from me, and deep down, I knew I couldn't resist. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the house settled into its oppressive silence, I gave in. I retrieved the camera, my hands trembling as I held it. The lens seemed to pulse, its glow matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. I loaded another roll of film, the motions mechanical, my mind numb. This time, I didn't plan where to take the photos. I simply wandered through the house, letting the camera guide me. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, each shot felt like a step closer to something I couldn't yet see. The last photo I took was of the basement door, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. When I developed the film, the images emerged slowly, their shapes and lines sharpening into focus. The first few photos were unremarkable, the rooms empty and still. But as I reached the last image, my breath caught. The basement door was wide open. The shadow stood in the doorway, its form sharper than ever, its face a void of nothingness. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, the darkness writhed, shapes moving within its depths. Figures, indistinct but unmistakable, crowded the frame, their faces blurred but watching. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their chaotic chorus. I stumbled back, the photo slipping from my hands, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The air felt colder, the shadows pressing closer, their edges sharp and deliberate. The camera pulsed in my hands, its glow intensifying. I knew what it wanted. It wasn't enough to take the photos. It wanted me to see, to understand. That night, the dreams were worse. I was standing in the basement, the shadow towering over me, its presence suffocating. Behind it, the figures from the photograph stood, their faces blank, their forms indistinct. The shadow extended a hand, its voice low and resonant. "You cannot escape," it said. "The cycle is eternal. The house, the camera, the shadow, they are one. And so are you." The dream shifted. I was holding the camera, its weight heavier than ever. The lens glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that illuminated the room. The shadow moved closer, its hand outstretched, pointing at the camera. "Look," it said. "See what you have brought." When I woke, the house was silent, but the silence was no longer comforting. It was alive, breathing, waiting. The shadow was no longer just in the photographs or the basement. It was everywhere, a constant presence that I could no longer escape. The whispers pressed against my thoughts, their tone insistent, demanding. The camera sat on the desk, its lens gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was waiting for me, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The choice was no longer mine to make. The house had consumed me. There was no denying it anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the shadows felt alive, purposeful. The whispers were a constant hum, threading through my thoughts like a melody I couldn't escape. The camera, now a permanent fixture on the desk, seemed to pulse with its own energy, its lens glowing faintly in the dim light. I knew the end was near. The shadow had grown too strong, too real. It wasn't just in the photographs or the basement, it was everywhere, a constant presence that I could feel in every breath. And the camera was at the center of it all, the key to a mystery I could no longer avoid. That night, I made my decision. I sat at the desk, the camera before me. Its weight felt heavier than ever as I picked it up, the lens glinting faintly in the moonlight. The whispers grew louder, their tone insistent, demanding. They weren't just guiding me now, they were commanding me. I loaded the last roll of film, my hands trembling as I turned the dials. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I raised the camera to my eye, the viewfinder framing the room in sharp relief. The first photo was of the living room, its furniture casting long shadows against the pale light. The second was the hallway, its emptiness almost mocking in its stillness. The third was the staircase, the shadows pooling at its base like liquid. And the final photo, the basement door. It was open. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The air was colder here, the darkness deeper. The whispers surrounded me, their tone rising and falling like the tide. At the bottom of the stairs, the shadow waited. It was fully formed now, its presence towering and suffocating. Behind it, the figures from the photographs stood, their forms indistinct but solid, their blank faces turned toward me. The shadow extended a hand, its voice low and resonant. "It is time," it said. "The cycle must continue." I raised the camera, the lens glowing faintly. The shadow moved closer, its void-like face inches from mine. The whispers became a roar, their chaotic chorus pressing against my thoughts. "You are the keeper," the shadow said. "The house, the camera, the shadow, they are one. And so are you." The shutter clicked. The world shifted. I was no longer in the basement. I was standing in a vast, empty space, its edges undefined, its air heavy with the weight of time. The shadow was there, its form larger than ever, its presence filling the void. The figures surrounded us, their faces still blank, their voices silent. "You have chosen," the shadow said. "The cycle continues. The keeper endures." The camera grew heavier in my hands, its glow fading until it was nothing more than a cold, lifeless object. The shadow reached out, its hand brushing against mine, and I felt a surge of energy, a connection that tied me to the house, to the camera, to the cycle. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the house. The camera sat on the desk, its lens dark, its presence still. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. The house felt different now, quieter, but no less alive. I sat at the desk, the weight of the decision settling over me. The cycle had begun anew, and I was its keeper. The house, the camera, the shadow, they were mine now. And I was theirs. The clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the empty halls. The second story. The clock arrived in a small, unassuming box, wrapped in layers of faded paper. It looked out of place against the modern world, the kind of object that seemed to belong to a different time entirely. I turned it over in my hands, admiring its intricate design. The brass casing was worn but elegant, etched with fine lines and curves that seemed to tell a story. Inside, the hands of the clock were frozen, pointing at random hours, as if they had been abandoned mid-tick. I didn't know much about its history. It had belonged to an old relative, someone distant enough that I didn't remember meeting them, but close enough that I'd been mentioned in their will. Alongside the clock came a short note, "For when the time is right." It seemed cryptic at the time, but I dismissed it. Perhaps it was just the ramblings of someone old and sentimental. For the first few days, the clock sat untouched on my desk. I'd glance at it occasionally, its presence more decorative than meaningful. Life carried on as normal. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to clean the clock, hoping to see its design more clearly. The soft hum of a nearby lamp filled the silence as I worked, carefully wiping away years of grime. As I polished the back of the clock, something caught my eye, a small engraving, faint but deliberate. It was a symbol, circular with an intricate pattern of intersecting lines and dots. It wasn't anything I recognized, a star, maybe, or a wheel. I tilted the clock, letting the light play over its surface, and for a moment, I thought I saw it shimmer. A shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it. Symbols on antique objects weren't uncommon, after all. It could have been a craftsman's mark or an embellishment with no real significance. Still, something about it nagged at me. I decided to look through the old photo albums my parents had left behind, hoping to find some context for the clock. The albums were dusty and worn, filled with faded images of people I barely recognized. I flipped through them idly, the familiar mix of curiosity and nostalgia tugging at my thoughts. And then I found it. A drawing, nestled between photographs of a family gathering. It was simple, almost childlike, but unmistakable, the same symbol etched into the back of the clock, drawn neatly in the corner of the page. Beneath it was a date, June 6, 1893. I stared at the drawing, my heart pounding. The date was older than I'd expected, older than the house itself. My eyes scanned the rest of the page, but there was no explanation, no context. Just the symbol and the date, as if that alone should have been enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. The clock sat on my desk, its frozen hands catching the faint glow of moonlight through the window. I tried to ignore it, to let exhaustion pull me into dreams, but my thoughts refused to settle. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came. I was standing in a grand hall, its walls lined with ornate mirrors and tapestries. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and something metallic. People moved around me, their faces indistinct, their movements slow and deliberate. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their voices a soft murmur that I couldn't quite make out. One of them turned toward me. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp and knowing. She stared at me as if she recognized me, as if she had been waiting for me. "You have it," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "The timekeeper." Before I could respond, the scene shifted. The grand hall dissolved, replaced by a darkened room lit only by the faint glow of a single candle. The clock was there, sitting on a pedestal, its hands spinning wildly. Shadows danced along the walls, their shapes twisting and writhing like living things. The whispers started softly, growing louder with each passing second. Words I couldn't understand, voices layered and urgent. They surrounded me, pulling me closer to the clock. And then I woke up. The room was silent, the faint hum of the lamp the only sound. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the memory of the dream clinging to me like a second skin. I turned to look at the clock, half expecting it to be gone, but it was still there, motionless and unassuming. Yet, somehow, I knew it wasn't the same. The next morning, the dreams lingered in my thoughts like a fog I couldn't escape. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my mind drifted back to the woman in the hall, her sharp eyes fixed on me, and the whispers that grew louder with every passing second. The clock sat on my desk, silent and unassuming, as though it had no part in what had unfolded the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers, that the clock was more than a simple heirloom. The symbol engraved on its back pulled at me, an unanswered question demanding my attention. I decided to revisit the photo album, hoping to find some detail I might have overlooked. The album was still on the coffee table where I'd left it, its worn pages a portal to the past. I flipped back to the drawing of the symbol, my fingers brushing over the faint pencil lines. The date beneath it, June 6, 1893, felt heavy with significance, though I didn't know why. Something caught my eye as I turned the page. A photograph, faded and yellowed with age, showed a group of people standing in front of the house. Their faces were stern, their clothing formal, and at their center stood a man holding a pocket watch. No, not a pocket watch, the clock. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The clock was unmistakable, its brass casing gleaming faintly even in the worn photograph. The man holding it looked directly at the camera, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and piercing. Beneath the photograph was a caption, "The opening of the house, June 6, 1893. My chest tightened. The house and the clock were connected, their histories intertwined in ways I couldn't yet understand. But why had the clock ended up with me? And what did it mean that it had come back to this house, more than a century later? The day passed in a haze, my thoughts consumed by the photograph and the questions it raised. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into shadow, I found myself drawn to the clock. It sat on my desk, its brass surface catching the dim light of the room. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. A faint ticking filled the air. I froze, my hand hovering over the clock. The sound was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The clock, which hadn't worked since it arrived, was ticking. I turned it over, my heart pounding in my chest. The hands, frozen since I first saw them, were moving now, their slow, deliberate motion marking the passage of time. Midnight was approaching, the second hand creeping closer to the 12 with each tick. The room felt colder, the shadows darker. The ticking grew louder, each sound echoing in my ears like a drumbeat. I tried to look away, to put the clock down, but I couldn't. My gaze was fixed on it, my thoughts tangled in its mechanical rhythm. The second hand reached the 12, and the clock chimed. The sound was low and resonant, a single note that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the house. The light flickered, the room plunging into darkness for a heartbeat before the lamp hummed back to life. I stared at the clock, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, carried on the air like a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, urgent, pleading. The sound came from somewhere in the house, pulling me toward it like an invisible thread. I rose from my chair, the clock still in my hand, and followed the voice. It led me down the hallway, past the familiar rooms of the house, until I reached the basement door. The voice grew louder as I stood there, the doorknob cold under my palm. The basement was a place I rarely visited. Its stone walls and dirt floor gave it an unsettling atmosphere, a feeling of being disconnected from the rest of the house. I hesitated, the whispers urging me forward, and then I opened the door. The air inside was damp and cool, the faint scent of earth filling my lungs. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the shadows growing thicker with each step. The voice guided me, soft but insistent, until I reached the center of the room. There, in the dim light, was a wooden chest. It was old, its surface scarred and weathered, the metal hinges rusted with time. The whispers faded as I knelt before it, the silence almost deafening in their absence. I hesitated, my hands trembling, and then I opened the chest. Inside were papers, their edges yellowed with age, and a small, leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal, its cover smooth and cool to the touch. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, the ink faded but legible. The first entry caught my attention. June 6, 1893. The house is complete. The clock has been placed as instructed. Tonight, we will see if the ritual succeeds. My breath caught in my throat. The journal belonged to the man in the photograph, the one holding the clock. The entries that followed were fragmented, filled with cryptic references to the keeper and the cycle. But one thing was clear, the clock was more than a simple heirloom. It was a key, a tool in some larger, darker plan. As I turned the pages, the whispers returned, their tone more urgent now. The clock in my hand grew warmer, its ticking louder, faster. I looked down at it, the hands spinning wildly, and the room around me seemed to blur. The last thing I saw before the world dissolved was the final entry in the journal. The river of time flows endlessly, but the keeper holds the key. Tonight, the cycle begins anew. And then everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating, pressing against my chest like a heavy weight. For a moment, I thought I was still in the basement, the journal in my hands, the clock ticking madly. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't there anymore. I stood in a vast, open hall, its walls lined with ornate mirrors that stretched up to a ceiling too high to see. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of old machinery. Shadows danced along the edges of the space, their shapes shifting and writhing like living things. The clock was still in my hand, its brass casing warm against my skin. Its ticking was steady now, no longer frantic but deliberate, each sound echoing in the cavernous hall. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was, but the space defied logic. It was as if I had stepped into a place between worlds. The whispers returned, soft at first, barely more than a hum. But as I stood there, they grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I couldn't make out the words, but their intent was clear. They were guiding me. Ahead, a faint light glimmered in the distance, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. I moved toward it, each step echoing in the stillness. The mirrors reflected my movements, but something about them was off. The reflections didn't always match me exactly. Sometimes they moved a second too late, or their expressions didn't align with my own. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing a pedestal at the center of the hall. On it sat another clock, identical to the one in my hand. Its surface gleamed in the flickering light, its hands frozen at midnight. As I drew closer, the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting to something almost reverent. I reached out to touch the clock, my fingers trembling. The moment my skin brushed against its surface, the room shifted. The hall dissolved, replaced by a scene so vivid it felt real. I was standing in the house, but it wasn't as I knew it. The walls were pristine, the furniture polished and new. Voices filled the air, laughter, conversation, the sounds of life. I turned to see people moving through the rooms, their faces familiar yet unrecognizable. At the center of it all stood the man from the photograph. He held the clock in his hands, his expression grave as he addressed the gathered crowd. "This house," he said, his voice clear and commanding, "stands as a testament to our work, to our commitment. Tonight, we begin the cycle anew." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces lit with a strange mixture of hope and fear. The man turned, his gaze meeting mine for a brief moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if he could see me, even though I knew that wasn't possible. The scene shifted again, the house dissolving into darkness. I was back in the hall, the whispers louder now, almost deafening. The clock on the pedestal glowed faintly, its hands beginning to move. Midnight was approaching. I looked down at the clock in my hand, its hands matching the movement of the one on the pedestal. The air around me grew colder, the shadows closing in, and the whispers became a single voice. "You are the keeper." The words sent a jolt through me, their weight pressing against my chest. The light from the clock flared, blinding me, and when it faded, I was back in the basement. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages glowing faintly. The final entry burned into my mind. The river of time flows endlessly, but the keeper holds the key. Tonight, the cycle begins anew. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. The whispers had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the room. The clock was still in my hand, its surface warm, its ticking steady. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, and returned to the main floor of the house. The air felt different now, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. The house was waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. The clock sat on the bedside table, its ticking a constant reminder of what had happened. My dreams were restless, filled with images of the hall, the man from the photograph, and the glowing clocks. When I woke, the clock's hands were frozen at midnight again, and the whispers had returned. The whispers didn't leave me alone that morning. Their tone was more persistent, laced with urgency, as if the house itself was pushing me towards something I wasn't ready to face. The clock sat in its usual place on the bedside table, frozen at midnight. Its silence was almost as unnerving as its sudden chimes had been. I tried to go about my day as usual, hoping to shake off the lingering unease from the night before, but it was impossible. Every corner of the house seemed charged with an unseen presence. The shadows felt heavier, darker, and the faint scent of metal hung in the air. It was as if the house was watching me, waiting for me to act. By the afternoon, I gave in. If the house wanted something, if the whispers were leading me toward an answer, I wasn't going to avoid it anymore. I returned to the basement, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. The entry about the river of time echoed in my thoughts, its cryptic phrasing both fascinating and terrifying. The basement was colder than I remembered, the stone walls damp with condensation. The chest where I had found the journal stood open, its contents scattered on the floor where I'd left them. I knelt beside it, searching through the remaining papers for anything I might have missed. Among the faded documents was a map. Its edges were frayed, and the ink was faint, but the lines and symbols were clear enough. It depicted the house and the surrounding land, but what caught my attention was the series of markings leading away from the property. They formed a winding path, ending at a symbol that matched the one on the clock. My heart raced as I traced the path with my finger. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting to something almost encouraging. Whatever this map was, it was important. It was the next step. I packed the map, the journal, and the clock into my bag and set out, following the markings. The air outside was crisp, the forest quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. The path was overgrown, the trees pressing close on either side, but the map guided me with unerring precision. Hours passed as I walked, the sun dipping lower in the sky. The forest grew denser, the light filtering through the canopy taking on an eerie, golden hue. The whispers had faded to a hum, their presence constant but less oppressive. It was as if they were waiting, watching to see what I would do. Finally, I reached the end of the path. Before me stood a structure, ancient and crumbling, its stone walls covered in moss and vines. It was circular, with an arched doorway that yawned like a mouth. The symbol from the clock was carved into the stone above the entrance, its lines weathered but unmistakable. I hesitated at the threshold, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The whispers surged, their tone urgent, almost pleading. I stepped inside. The air was heavy and cold, the faint scent of damp earth filling my lungs. The interior was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw that the walls were lined with carvings. They depicted scenes of people gathered around clocks, their faces lit with reverence or fear. In some, the clocks glowed faintly, in others, they were shattered. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested another clock. It was larger than mine, its design more intricate, its hands spinning slowly, defying logic. The whispers grew louder as I approached, their tone a mixture of command and desperation. When I reached the pedestal, I hesitated. The clock's surface gleamed faintly, its ticking steady and deliberate. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, as if the clock was alive. I glanced down at the journal in my bag, its words flashing in my mind. The keeper holds the key. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the clock's surface. The room around me dissolved. I was standing in a river, its waters black and swirling. The current tugged at my legs, its strength almost overwhelming. Figures stood on the banks, their forms indistinct, their eyes fixed on me. One of them stepped forward, its face pale and gaunt, its expression unreadable. "You have come," it said, its voice low and resonant. "The cycle begins with you." Before I could respond, the river surged, pulling me under. The water was cold and suffocating, its darkness pressing against me like a weight. Flashes of light and shadow danced around me, images of the house, the clocks, the journal. The whispers were deafening now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. And then, everything went still. I opened my eyes to find myself back in the room with the pedestal. The clock in my hand was glowing faintly, its ticking steady and deliberate. The whispers had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the space. The carvings on the walls had changed. The scenes now depicted me, standing in the river, the figures watching from the banks. My heart raced as I took in the images, their meaning both clear and incomprehensible. The whispers returned, soft and distant, their tone almost mournful. "You are the keeper," they said. "And the river remembers." I stumbled back to the house, my thoughts racing. The journal, the map, the clocks, they were all connected, threads in a tapestry I couldn't yet see. The cycle had begun, and I was at its center. That night, I dreamed of the river again. The figures stood on its banks, their eyes fixed on me, their voices blending into a single, haunting phrase. The river flows, and the keeper remembers. The house felt heavier when I returned, as if it had absorbed the energy of the journey I had just taken. The whispers had grown quieter, but their presence lingered, threading through the air like an unspoken promise. The journal, the map, and the clock sat on the table, each an artifact of a mystery that seemed to deepen with every step I took. I couldn't bring myself to touch the clock again, at least not yet. The vision of the river, the figures watching me from the banks, was too fresh in my mind. Their words, "The cycle begins with you," echoed relentlessly, their meaning just out of reach. I needed answers, but the house offered none. That night, the dreams returned. I was standing on the edge of the river, its black waters churning violently. The figures were closer this time, their forms more distinct, their faces pale and sharp. One of them stepped forward, its movements deliberate, its eyes fixed on mine. "You are the keeper," it said, its voice low and resonant. "The river flows through you." Before I could respond, the scene shifted. I was in the house, but it wasn't as I knew it. The walls were cracked, the furniture broken and scattered. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of decay hung in the air. The clock sat on the table, its hands spinning wildly, its ticking a deafening roar. A figure stood in the corner, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating. The clock's ticking grew louder, the sound pressing against my ears until I thought I would break. And then I woke up. The house was silent, the air heavy with the weight of the dream. The clock sat on the table, its hands frozen at midnight once more. The journal was open, its pages blank except for a single line. "The keeper holds the key." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. The journal had been filled with entries before, its pages a map of cryptic phrases and fragmented thoughts. Now, it was as if the house itself had erased them, leaving only what it wanted me to see. The next morning, I decided to return to the basement. The air was colder there, the shadows darker, but it was the only place where I felt I might find clarity. The chest was still open, its contents scattered, but one object caught my attention, a small, rusted key. It was tucked into a corner of the chest, hidden beneath a pile of faded papers. The key was simple, unadorned, but its presence felt deliberate. I turned it over in my hand, its weight heavier than it should have been. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, their tone urging me forward. I searched the basement for a lock that might match the key, my fingers brushing over the rough stone walls and the floorboards that creaked underfoot. Finally, I found it, a hidden door, its edges barely visible in the dim light. The key slid into the lock with ease, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was small, its walls lined with shelves filled with objects, clocks of all shapes and sizes, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the darkness. At the center of the room was a table, and on it lay another journal. This one was older, its leather cover cracked and worn, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it, my breath catching as I read the first entry. June 7th, 1893. The ritual has begun. The keeper has been chosen. The river will guide us. The entries that followed were detailed, written in a hand that was both precise and hurried. They spoke of the clock's power, of its connection to the river, of the cycle that bound them all. Each entry was a piece of a puzzle, a fragment of a story that was both ancient and ongoing. As I read, the whispers grew louder, their tone urgent. The final entry caught my attention. The river remembers. The keeper holds the key. When the clock strikes 12, the cycle begins anew. The clock in my hand began to tick, its sound steady and deliberate. Midnight was approaching, and the whispers had become a chorus. I returned to the main floor of the house, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. The air was thick with anticipation, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. The clock's ticking grew louder, each sound echoing through the house like a drumbeat. When the hands reached 12, the clock chimed. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my chest. The light flickered, and the house seemed to shift, its edges blurring, its walls bending. The whispers became a roar, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. And then, I was back at the river. The water was calm now, its surface smooth and reflective. The figures stood on the banks, their eyes fixed on me, their expressions unreadable. One of them stepped forward, its voice clear and commanding. The keeper holds the key. The river flows through you. I stared at the figure, my thoughts racing. The cycle, the clocks, the river, it was all connected, threads in a tapestry I couldn't yet see. But one thing was clear, I was part of it now. The keeper, the river, the house, they were one, and I was bound to them. As the figures faded into the shadows, the whispers softened, their tone almost mournful. The river flowed on, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. And I stood there, knowing that the cycle had only just begun. The house was no longer just a structure. It felt alive, its walls humming with an energy I couldn't see but could feel in every breath. The clock sat on the table, its brass surface gleaming faintly in the dim light, as though it was aware of its own significance. Midnight had passed, but its hands remained frozen, as if waiting for the next cycle. I couldn't sleep. The whispers had softened, but they hadn't disappeared. They lingered at the edge of my thoughts, pulling me towards something I couldn't name. The journal I'd found in the hidden room lay open before me, its entries a puzzle of cryptic references and fragmented thoughts. Each word felt heavy with meaning, yet none of it made sense. The river flows through you, I murmured, repeating the phrase the figure at the river had spoken. It was the only clear thread in the chaos, but its meaning was elusive. The river, the house, the clocks, they were all connected, but how? And why me? As dawn broke, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The map I'd found earlier had led me to the hidden room, but there was more to it. The markings extended beyond the house, winding through the forest like veins. If I wanted answers, I had to follow them. The air was crisp as I stepped outside, the morning light cutting through the lingering shadows. The map guided me, its lines and symbols etched into my mind. The whispers grew louder as I walked, their tone shifting to something almost encouraging. It was as if the house, or whatever force was guiding this, wanted me to continue. The path was overgrown, the trees pressing close on either side. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Hours passed as I followed the markings, each step pulling me deeper into the unknown. Finally, I reached another clearing. At its center stood a stone structure, smaller than the one I'd found before, but no less imposing. The symbol from the clock was carved into its surface, its lines sharp and deliberate. The air around it was heavy, charged with an unseen energy. I approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder with each step. The entrance was narrow, barely more than a crack in the stone, but it was enough. I slipped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The room was small, its walls lined with carvings similar to those I'd seen in the first structure. They depicted scenes of people standing before clocks, their faces lit with reverence or fear. At the center of the room was another pedestal, and on it rested yet another clock. This one was different. Its casing was darker, its design more intricate. The hands were frozen, as they had been on the others, but its ticking was faint, barely audible. The whispers filled the room, their tone a mixture of command and urgency. I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The clock seemed alive, its presence suffocating yet compelling. I reached out, my fingers brushing against its surface. The world shifted. I was back at the river, but this time, it wasn't calm. The waters churned violently, their surface broken by flashes of light and shadow. The figures stood on the banks, their forms more distinct now, their eyes sharp and knowing. One of them stepped forward, its voice clear and resonant. "The cycle continues," it said. "The keeper must decide." Before I could respond, the river surged, pulling me under. The water was cold and suffocating, its current dragging me deeper into its depths. Flashes of light surrounded me, images of the house, the clocks, the figures. The whispers were deafening now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. And then, everything went still. I opened my eyes to find myself in another room, this one larger and grander than the others. The walls were lined with shelves filled with objects, mirrors, books, trinkets, all radiating the same energy as the clocks. At the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a single page. I approached cautiously, the whispers softening as I neared the table. The page was yellowed with age, its edges frayed, but the words written on it were clear. "The keeper holds the key. The river flows through time, but the choice is yours. Restore the cycle, or break it." The words sent a chill through me. Restore the cycle, or break it. The choice was mine, but the consequences were unimaginable. The river, the clocks, the house, they were all tied to this decision, and whatever I chose would ripple through time itself. The whispers returned, louder now, their tone urgent and pleading. The clocks in the room began to tick, their sounds blending into a single, resonant beat. I stared at the page, my heart pounding, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The cycle had brought me here, but now, it was up to me to decide what came next. The weight of the decision hung over me like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. The words on the page, "Restore the cycle," or "break it," echoed in my mind, their meaning both clear and incomprehensible. The whispers grew softer now, their urgency tempered by an air of expectation. The house, the clocks, the river, they were all waiting for me. I returned to the house, the page folded carefully and tucked into my pocket. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cooler, the breeze carrying a faint metallic tang that I had come to associate with the clocks. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and still, its presence both familiar and foreboding. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. The clock on the table sat motionless, its hands frozen at midnight. The journal lay open beside it, its pages blank save for a single line. "The keeper decides." I paced the room, my thoughts tangled in the enormity of the choice before me. Restoring the cycle would mean continuing whatever force had been at work here for over a century. Breaking it might mean freedom, but at what cost? The river's power was undeniable, its reach far greater than I could comprehend. Could I truly sever its connection to the clocks, to the house, to myself? As the hours passed, the whispers returned, soft but insistent. They guided me back to the basement, to the hidden room filled with clocks. The air there was colder, the shadows darker, but the clocks seemed to glow faintly, their energy pulsing in time with the whispers. At the center of the room was the pedestal, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The clock that rested there was different from the others, larger, more intricate, its brass casing etched with symbols I hadn't seen before. The hands were frozen at midnight, but the faint ticking that emanated from it was steady and deliberate. I stepped closer, the whispers growing louder with each step. The energy in the room intensified, pressing against my chest, my lungs, my thoughts. The clock seemed to pulse with life, its presence suffocating yet compelling. I reached out, my fingers brushing against its surface. The world shifted. I was back at the river, but it wasn't calm. The waters churned violently, their surface broken by flashes of light and shadow. The figures stood on the banks, their forms more distinct now, their eyes sharp and knowing. One of them stepped forward, its voice clear and resonant. "The keeper holds the key," it said. "The river flows through time, but the cycle binds it. To restore is to endure. To break is to unravel." The water surged, pulling me under. The cold enveloped me, the current dragging me deeper into its depths. Flashes of light surrounded me, images of the house, the clocks, the figures. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. And then, everything went still. I opened my eyes to find myself in another room, this one unlike any I had seen before. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces reflecting not just my image but scenes from the past. I saw the house as it had been in 1893, its halls filled with people, their faces alight with hope and fear. I saw the man from the photograph, his expression grave as he held the clock in his hands. "The cycle begins anew," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "The keeper will decide." The mirrors shifted, their images changing to show the river, its waters calm and reflective. The figures stood on its banks, their eyes fixed on me. Their voices blended into a single, haunting phrase. "The river remembers." The mirrors dissolved, replaced by darkness. The whispers returned, their tones softer now, almost mournful. "You are the keeper," they said. "The choice is yours." I found myself back in the house, the pedestal before me, the clock in my hand. The air was heavy with expectation, the shadows pressing against the edges of my vision. The clock's hands began to move, their motion slow but deliberate. Midnight was approaching. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, resonant command. "Decide." The choice was mine. To restore the cycle, or to break it. To endure, or to unravel. The river's power flowed through me now, its energy a part of my very being. But what did it mean to choose? What did it mean to be the keeper? The clock's ticking grew louder, its sound filling the room, the house, the world. Midnight was near, and with it, the moment of decision. The river's memory stretched before me, vast and endless, its depths unfathomable. And as the clock's hands reached 12, I knew there was no turning back. The clock's chime reverberated through the house, a sound so deep and resonant that it seemed to shake the very foundations. Midnight had come, and with it, the choice I had been dreading. The whispers surged in a cacophony of voices, their tone both desperate and commanding. "The river remembers. The keeper decides." I clutched the clock in my hand, its weight heavier than it had ever been. The hands glowed faintly now, casting a soft light that illuminated the room. The journal sat open on the table, its pages blank except for one final line. "The cycle ends where it begins." The room began to change. The walls seemed to ripple like water, their edges blurring and bending. The whispers faded, replaced by a low hum that vibrated in my chest. I was no longer in the house. I was standing at the river's edge, its black waters calm and reflective. The figures were there, their forms clear and distinct, their eyes filled with something I could only describe as expectation. One of them stepped forward, their face pale and gaunt, their movements slow and deliberate. "You have seen the truth," it said, its voice low and resonant. "The river flows through time, binding all it touches. To restore the cycle is to endure its weight. To break it is to unmake its memory." The choice was before me, vast and incomprehensible. Restoring the cycle would mean accepting the role of keeper, carrying the burden of the river's memory and ensuring its flow continued. Breaking it would sever the river's connection to time itself, unraveling everything it had touched. The figure gestured toward the water, its surface rippling faintly. "Look," it said. I stepped closer, the cold air biting at my skin. The river's surface shimmered, revealing scenes from the past. I saw the house as it had been on the night of the first cycle, the man from the photograph standing at the river's edge, the clock in his hand. I saw the villagers drawn into the water, their faces frozen in fear and resignation. And then I saw myself, standing where I was now, the clock glowing faintly in my hand. "The river remembers," the figure said. "And now, so must you." I turned back to the figure, my mind racing. What happens if I break the cycle? "The river will forget," it said simply. "Its memory will fade, and with it, the ties that bind. The clocks, the house, the figures, all will cease to be. And if I restore it, the cycle will continue," it said. "The keeper endures, and the river flows on." The weight of the decision pressed against me, its enormity almost suffocating. The whispers returned, their tones softer now, almost mournful. The figures watched me, their eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Hope? Fear? Acceptance? I looked down at the clock in my hand, its surface warm, its ticking steady. Midnight was slipping away, the moment of decision drawing closer. The river's surface shimmered, its memory stretching out before me, vast and endless. I closed my eyes, the clock's warmth spreading through me, its rhythm aligning with my own heartbeat. The choice was mine, but the consequences were unimaginable. As the clock struck the final chime, I opened my eyes and made my decision.